Welcome to this journey through one of the most perplexing and unexplained cases ever documented in the American South. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We are interested to know how far these documented accounts reach and at what moments of day or night they find their listeners. In the winter of 1839, something began in Savannah, Georgia, that would challenge everything the wealthy plantation owners of the region believed about the world, about human nature, and about the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural. It started with whispers among dock workers and field hands, spread to the offices of merchants and ministers, and eventually reached the highest circles of Georgia society, where it would remain a closely guarded secret for more than a century. The story centers on two young men who would become known as Solomon and Silas, twin brothers whose very existence seemed to defy the natural order, born from the same womb, yet appearing as opposites, fire and ice made flesh. Solomon possessed skin described in auction records as light as Georgia clay in summer drought, with eyes of the palest gray that seemed to hold no warmth whatsoever. Silas, his twin, was described as having skin rich as mahogany, with eyes so dark they appeared to absorb light itself, deep pools that observers claimed could see through to a man's soul. Together they formed a duality that observers found profoundly disturbing, not because of their contrasting appearances alone, though that was remarkable enough, but because of something in their presence, in the way they seemed to occupy space in the identical rhythm of their breathing, that suggested they were not truly two separate beings, but rather two halves of a single incomprehensible entity. This is not a story of brotherhood in any conventional sense. This is a chronicle of fear, obsession, and inexplicable phenomena that surrounded two men whose very existence seemed to mock the rigid social hierarchies upon which Southern society was built. What you are about to hear has been pieced together from plantation records, shipping manifests, court documents, and personal diaries that remain hidden in private collections until recently. The first documented reference to the brothers appears in the ledger of the Crawford Auction House in Savannah, dated January 22, 1839. The entry is unusual in several respects. Unlike typical slave auction records, which provided detailed physical descriptions to establish value, this entry contains only a brief notation. Twin males approximately 22 years of age, one mulatto of unusual pale complexion, one Negro of pure dark complexion. Origin unknown. Sold as single lot to intermediary for Whitmore interests. Price withheld from public record. The selling price, when it was finally discovered in private Whitmore family papers in 1971, was staggering, $22,000, at a time when a strong field might sell for $1,200, and even the most skilled artisan rarely exceeded $2,500. What made these particular men worth such an extraordinary sum? Captain Jeremiah Walsh, a merchant marine who happened to be in Savannah that January day, recorded his impressions in a journal that would not be made public until his descendant donated it to the Georgia Historical Society in 1958. He wrote, "I have witnessed many unfortunate souls sold into bondage during my years at sea, a practice I find increasingly difficult to reconcile with Christian teaching. But today I saw something that troubled me in an entirely different manner. The twin men on the block stood side by side, their hands clasped together, creating a visual contrast so stark it seemed almost supernatural. One pale as marble, one dark as polished ebony, yet their faces were identical in every feature, mirror images that somehow emphasized rather than diminished their opposition." The journal continues, "They did not speak or show emotion as so many do. They simply stood with a composure that seemed almost inhuman and observed the crowd with eyes that appeared to see far more than they should. What disturbed me most was the sensation I experienced when both turned their gazes upon me simultaneously. One pair of eyes pale and cold as winter ice, one pair dark and fathomless as the ocean depths, but both looking at me with the exact same expression, the exact same intensity. I had the most peculiar feeling, as though their dual gaze was peeling away layers of pretense, seeing every lie I had ever told, every secret I had ever kept. I left the auction house with an inexplicable sense of dread that persisted for several days. The Whitmore family was among the most powerful in Georgia. They controlled two massive plantations totaling more than 12,000 acres, held significant political influence in both state and national Whig Party circles, and maintained extensive business connections throughout the South and into Boston shipping houses. Whatever motivated them to pay such an unprecedented sum for the twins, it was not a casual whim. Unlike every other enslaved person purchased by the Whitmore interest that year, Solomon and Silas were not sent to work in the rice fields or even among the household staff. Instead, according to architectural records and servant testimonies collected decades later, they were housed in a specially converted carriage house on the Whitmore estate, a structure that had been hastily modified with reinforced doors and barred windows accessible only through a single guarded entrance. This arrangement generated immediate speculation. Plantation owners simply did not house enslaved individuals in isolated, secured structures unless they were being punished or posed some kind of threat. To dedicate an entire building to two newly acquired men suggested either extraordinary value or extraordinary danger. The truth, as later evidence would suggest, was both. The Whitmore family was not merely containing the twins, they were studying them. The first indication that something was profoundly wrong came in March 1839, barely 2 months after the twins' arrival. Dr. Nathaniel Petion, the family physician who maintained detailed records of all medical matters concerning the Whitmore household, was summoned to examine injuries both brothers had sustained. His report, preserved in the archives of the Savannah Medical Society, contains observations that he clearly struggled to explain. I was called to attend to burns on the right hands of both males known as Solomon and Silas. The wounds appeared identical in location, severity, and pattern, which was peculiar given that they had supposedly been injured in separate incidents involving different heat sources. More remarkable still, based on the initial report from Mr. Whitmore's overseer, the burns were approximately 72 hours old. However, upon examination, I found the injuries had healed to a degree that would typically require at least 2 to 3 weeks. The scar tissue was mature, the inflammation entirely absent, and both subjects reported no pain or limited mobility. Dr. Petion's report continued with increasingly disturbed observations. What troubles me most is not merely the accelerated healing, but the absolute symmetry between the two subjects. When I examined Solomon's pulse, it measured approximately 52 beats per minute. Silas's pulse, measured simultaneously by my assistant, was exactly the same. And more remarkably, the beats occurred in perfect synchronization, as though both hearts were controlled by a single mechanism. When I tested their reflexes, responses occurred at precisely the same instant in both subjects. The doctor's final observation revealed his deep unease. I attempted to engage them in separate examinations, placing them in different rooms of the carriage house, but both became severely agitated, exhibiting rapid breathing and signs of acute distress until they were reunited. Most disturbing was what occurred when they were brought back together. As their hands touched, both men exhaled simultaneously, and I observed what I can only describe as a ripple effect, as though energy or force passed between them, visible as a brief shimmer in the air surrounding their clasped hands. I left the Whitmore estate with an inexplicable sense of unease that persisted for several days. The enslaved community in Savannah developed its own understanding of the twins, passed their whispered conversations in quarters, and during the brief periods of communal gathering permitted on Sundays. An elderly man named Josiah, interviewed in 1935 when he was 101 years old, recalled his time as a blacksmith on a plantation neighboring the Whitmore estate. We knew not to speak their names where white folks could hear, but among ourselves we called them the Fire and Ice Brothers, because one burned cold and one burned hot. But they both burned the same. The old folks said they wasn't altogether of this world, said something had touched their mama before they was born, something that marked them for a purpose we couldn't understand. The horses knew it. Horses always know. They would rear and refuse to pass near the carriage house. Even the calmest plow horses would balk and turn away. But here's the strange part. The horses couldn't decide which one scared them more. They'd see the pale one and shy, then see the dark one and bolt. Another account, recorded in 1931 from a woman named Esther, who had been enslaved on the Whitmore property, provided additional details. Mr. Solomon and Mr. Silas. They never worked a regular day that I saw. They kept them in that carriage house, and sometimes you'd see them through the windows, always standing together, always touching somehow, like they couldn't bear to be separated even by an inch. But it was the temperature that told you when they'd been somewhere. Two temperatures actually coming together. One cold, like winter wind, sharp and biting. The other hot, like forge fire, heavy and oppressive. But when those two temperatures mixed together, it made something else entirely, something that made your skin prickle and your breath catch. The phenomenon of the dual temperature appears in numerous accounts from various sources. In April 1839, Colonel Benjamin Ashford, a cotton factor and close associate of the Whitmore family, recorded in his private diary, attended business meeting at the Whitmore residence. Throughout the afternoon, I was aware of unusual temperature fluctuations seemingly coming from different parts of the house simultaneously. One area would be inexplicably cold, causing frost to form on windows despite the spring warmth, while another would be stifling hot, causing sweat to bead on one's brow. As the day progressed, these temperature zones seemed to move and merge, creating pockets of air that were both hot and cold at once, a sensation so disorienting it made me feel ill. When I mentioned it to Robert Whitmore, he became noticeably uncomfortable and changed the subject. By the summer of 1839, the situation at the Whitmore estate had apparently become serious enough to warrant outside intervention. This is when the family made the fateful decision to involve the church, specifically requesting the assessment of Reverend Jonathan Pierce, a Presbyterian minister known for his stern theological views and his reputation for spiritual discernment. Reverend Pierce's encounter with the twins is documented in fragments of his own diary that survived despite his later attempts to destroy his papers. The entry is dated June 15, 1839. I was summoned to the Whitmore estate to provide spiritual counsel regarding a matter they described as urgent. Upon arrival, I was taken to the converted carriage house to meet the twin men known as Solomon and Silas. They stood together near the window, their shoulders touching, their breathing synchronized in a manner that seemed almost ritualistic. The contrast between them was stark. One possessed of the palest complexion I have ever observed, almost translucent in the afternoon light. The other, so dark he seemed to absorb the very light around him, like a void in human form. Yet their faces were identical in every feature, mirror images that somehow emphasized rather than diminished their opposition. The diary continues. What disturbed me most was the sensation I experienced when both turned their gazes upon me simultaneously. One pair of eyes pale and penetrating, one pair dark and fathomless, but both looking at me with the exact same expression, the exact same intensity. I had the most peculiar sensation, as though their dual gaze was reaching into my mind from two directions at once, extracting memories that I had long suppressed. I thought of my daughter dead these 15 years, and of the anger I had felt toward God for taking her. I thought of doubts I had harbored about my calling, doubts I had never confessed to anyone. All of this rushed through my consciousness in the space of seconds, and I had the terrible suspicion that they were aware of every thought, that together they were reading my soul like scripture, open before them. The intrigue grows more disturbed. I attempted to engage them in conversation about spiritual matters, about salvation and redemption. When Solomon finally spoke, his words were not those of an ignorant or uneducated person. He said in a voice that seemed to resonate with impossibly high tones, "Reverend, you speak of one God." Then Silas continued, his voice lower and deeper, but perfectly synchronized with his brother's rhythm. "But what if divinity itself is divided?" Then together in perfect unison they said, "What if there are souls that exist in duality who were never meant to be unified, who simply are?" The effect of their combined voices speaking as one was profoundly unsettling. It created overtones that seemed to vibrate in my chest, harmonics that should not be possible from human vocal cords. What happened next is described in a subsequent entry dated June 17, 1839, written in noticeably shaken handwriting. I preached this Sunday on the theme of God's unity, as I have done countless times before, but when I reached the pulpit and looked out at the congregation, I found I could not continue with my prepared sermon. Instead, I heard myself saying words I had not planned. I said, "Do not seek unity, for division is already among us, walking in two forms, speaking with two mouths, seeing with 4 eyes, feeling with 2 hearts that beat as one." The congregation sat in stunned silence. I cannot explain what came over me. I felt as though I was standing outside my own body, watching myself speak words that were not mine. Reverend Pierce resigned from his pulpit in July 1839, citing health concerns. He never ministered again. His wife, in a letter to her sister, wrote, "Jonathan is not the man he was. Something happened during his visit to that cursed place. He wakes at night in terror, and sometimes I hear him weeping and speaking of mirrors and shadows and twins who are really one. He says, we are not safe, that there are things walking in the world that should not be. I fear greatly for his sanity." The impact of the twins' presence was not limited to those who met them directly. Throughout the summer and fall of 1839, a series of inexplicable events plagued the families and businesses associated with the Whitmore interests. Robert Whitmore's business partner, Samuel Hutchinson, died suddenly of an apparent heart attack at age 38. His widow mentioned in her private correspondence that in the weeks before his death, Samuel had become obsessed with the temperature problem at the Whitmore and had begun keeping their home at extreme temperatures, alternating rooms between freezing cold and stifling heat. The overseer at one of the Whitmore plantations, Daniel Crawford, began exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior in September 1839. According to testimony from other plantation employees, Crawford claimed he could feel two presences watching him constantly, one burning hot on his left side, one freezing cold on his right. He told his wife that he had seen the twins standing at the edge of the rice fields at dawn, though the Whitmore family insisted they never left their carriage house. On October 12, 1839, Daniel Crawford was found dead in his quarters from what was ruled a stroke. His final journal entry contained only a single sentence, written and rewritten dozens of times. They are not two. They are not two. They are not two. Most disturbing was the case of Thomas Whitmore, Robert's younger brother, who managed the family's shipping operations. In November 1839, Thomas became convinced that the twins were somehow responsible for a series of warehouse fires and freezing incidents that had damaged valuable cargo. He told his wife that he had seen them standing at the docks one evening, and as he watched, they had stepped toward each other, and where their silhouettes overlapped, reality itself seemed to shimmer and distort. 2 weeks later, Thomas Whitmore was discovered in his office, dead from what appeared to be simultaneous heat stroke and hypothermia, a medical impossibility. He left no formal note, but on his desk was found a piece of paper with a crude drawing showing two male figures, one shaded light and one shaded dark, with an equal sign followed by a single figure that was half light and half dark. Below the drawing were the words, "God help us when they remember they are one." It was after Thomas's death that the Whitmore family made the decision to invite scientific examination of the twins. Dr. DeMarcus Holley was a physician from Charleston with advanced medical training in European institutions. He was brought to Savannah in December 1839 under conditions of strict confidentiality, paid a substantial fee, and given unusual latitude to conduct examinations that would not have been permitted under normal circumstances. Dr. Holloway's research journal, discovered in 1978 in a private collection in South Carolina, provides clinical details that read like something from a Gothic novel. His entry from December 28, 1839, describes an experiment with temperature regulation. I have conducted a series of tests to determine whether there exists any physiological connection between the subjects beyond their obvious genetic relationship. When I exposed Solomon to extreme cold, his body temperature dropped as expected. But simultaneously Silas's body temperature rose proportionally, despite being in a separate room with no external heat source. When I reversed the procedure, exposing Silas to cold, Solomon's temperature rose. It was as though their bodies were maintaining a collective equilibrium, balancing each other like opposite sides of a scale. A subsequent entry reveals even more disturbing findings. When the subjects are separated by distance, even by a simple partition placed between them, so they cannot see or hear each other, both exhibit immediate and severe distress. Heart rates elevate dramatically, breathing becomes labored, and they begin to call out to each other in voices that seem to harmonize impossibly. But here is what truly defies explanation. Despite their obvious distress, their physiological responses remained in perfect synchronization. Their hearts beat in unison. Their breathing fell into identical patterns as though they remained connected by some mechanism science has yet to discover. More remarkably, the temperature anomalies around them intensified during separation, with frost forming on one side of the partition and scorch marks appearing on the other. Doctored as is of the sea, Holley's entries became increasingly troubled. On January 10, 1840, he wrote, "I have begun to question the wisdom of this investigation. The subjects are affecting me in ways I cannot explain. I find myself thinking in dual patterns, considering problems from two opposing perspectives simultaneously. More troubling are the dreams. For the past week, I have experienced vivid nightmares in which I perceive the world through four eyes simultaneously, two perspectives that somehow merge into a single vision that is more complete than ordinary sight. In these dreams, I am both Solomon and Silas, experiencing existence from both viewpoints at once. And I understand with terrible clarity that they are not truly separate individuals, but rather two halves of a single consciousness that has been split between two bodies." An entry from January 25, 1840, reveals Holloway's growing fear. "I have conducted an experiment that I now deeply regret. I asked the subjects to attempt speaking simultaneously, saying different words. Solomon said, 'We are,' while Silas said 'divided soul,' but their words overlapped in such a way that the sounds merged And what I heard was a third phrase that neither had spoken individually, something that sounded like "we are divided, soul-seeking unity." When I insisted they had said different things simultaneously, they smiled, and Solomon said, "Perhaps you heard the truth that lies between our words." Silas completed the thought. "Perhaps you heard what we actually are, rather than what we appear to be." The final entries in Halle's journal reveal a man on the edge of psychological collapse. On February 3, 1840, he wrote, "This morning, while conducting routine examinations, I positioned myself so that Solomon was to my left and Silas to my right, and for a brief moment I could see both simultaneously in my peripheral vision. In that moment I perceived an overlay, a visual phenomenon, where the two figures seemed to occupy the same space, one light and one dark, creating a composite image that was neither one nor the other, but something in between. When I shifted my gaze to look directly, the effect vanished. But I cannot shake the conviction that what I glimpsed in that peripheral moment was the truth." His final entry, dated February 5, 1840, contains a desperate warning. "I am leaving Savannah immediately and will not return. The subjects are not what the whites believe them to be. They are not merely twins with an unusually strong connection. They are fragments of something that was never meant to be divided, something that is actively seeking to become whole again. I strongly advise that they be kept separated at all times, that they never be allowed to touch for extended periods, and that under no circumstances should they be allowed to stand in direct sunlight together at noon, when shadows are shortest. I have seen what happens when they stand together at midday. Their shadows merge into one, and in that unified shadow I saw the outline of something that was neither fully Solomon nor fully Silas, but a third form that contained both." Dr. Marcus Holloway was found dead in a marsh outside Savannah 6 days later. His body showed no signs of violence or struggle. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning, though the medical examiner noted several peculiarities. The body had decomposed far more rapidly than would be expected. More bizarrely, the examiner noted that half of Halle's body appeared to have been frozen, while the other half showed signs of severe burns, as though he had been simultaneously subjected to extreme cold and extreme heat. Most disturbing was a detail mentioned only in the examiner's private notes. Halle's eyes had changed color. One had become very pale, almost colorless, while the other had become very dark, almost black. After Dr. Halle's death, the Whitmore family's approach to the twins changed dramatically. New rules were implemented with strict enforcement. The twins were no longer allowed to touch each other or be in physical contact for more than brief moments. Their quarters within the carriage house were divided with a heavy partition. All reflective surfaces were removed. Most significantly, they were never allowed to be in direct sunlight together at the same time, particularly during the noon hour when the sun was at its zenith and shadows were at their shortest. A letter from Robert Whitmore to his cousin, written in March 1840, provides some insight. "We have been advised that the subjects must be kept as separate as possible, without causing them actual harm. It seems their connection strengthens when they are in physical contact, and that sunlight, particularly at noon, somehow facilitates this strengthening." Thomas understood this before his death, though it drove him to despair. He saw something that convinced him of the danger. I think of them sometimes, those poor creatures split between two forms, longing to become whole. Is it mercy to keep them separated, or is it cruelty? Despite these precautions, incidents continued. Servants reported hearing voices at night, two voices in perfect harmony. Though the twins' quarters were separated by a thick partition, the temperature anomalies grew stronger, spreading beyond the carriage house to affect the main residence. Guests began declining invitations, though the truth was never openly discussed. The estate had acquired a disturbing reputation. In May 1840, a new phenomenon began. Several neighboring plantation owners reported seeing identical figures, one pale and one dark, standing at the boundaries of their properties at dawn and dusk. The figures never moved, never spoke, simply stood watching. The disturbing aspect was that these sightings occurred simultaneously at different locations, miles apart at times when the Whitmore household staff swore both twins were secured in their quarters. A planter named Harrison Cole recorded in his diary, "I saw them again this morning, standing at the boundary of my eastern field. I took my rifle and approached, but as I drew near, I realized I could see through them as though they were projections or spirits. I called out, and both turned to face me. Then they began to walk toward each other, and as they did, they became more solid, more real. When they met and touched hands, there was a moment when I could not distinguish between them. The air around them shimmer-red, and I felt a wave of temperature so extreme it drove me to my knees, simultaneously burning and freezing. Then they were gone, leaving only that strange dual sensation and a feeling of profound wrongness. The Whitmore family, growing increasingly desperate, contacted Professor Elijah Morgan from Harvard College, who specialized in mesmerism and phenomena of the mind. He arrived in June 1840 and spent 3 weeks attempting to study the twins. His private journal tells a disturbing story. June 20th, 1840. The subjects exhibit a connection that transcends any known biological or psychological mechanism. They complete each other's thoughts, mirror each other's movements, and display physiological responses that synchronize regardless of physical separation. More remarkably, they seem capable of projecting themselves beyond their physical bodies. I have verified with the household staff that both subjects were in their quarters at times when they were reportedly seen miles away. Professor Morgan's journal entry from June 28th reveals his growing alarm. I have begun to dream their dreams. Vivid visions of a time before their birth, of a single soul being torn in half, of light and darkness separating into distinct forms, of a terrible loneliness that can only be assuaged by reunification. Last night I dreamed I was standing between two mirrors, and in each reflection I saw a different version of myself, one pale and one dark, and they were reaching toward each other through me. The professor's final entry, dated July 1st, 1840, is chilling. Last night, I was awakened around 3 a.m. by a sensation of extreme temperature fluctuation. When I opened my eyes, I saw them both standing at the foot of my bed. Though I knew this was impossible as their quarters were locked, they were holding hands, and where their hands joined, the boundary between them seemed to blur and shimmer. The temperature in the room was both freezing and boiling simultaneously. They spoke in unison. "We are tired of being divided. We want to be whole again." Then they simply faded. I will recommend to the Whitmores that they release these men, for I do not believe any force on earth can keep them separated much longer. Professor Morgan's warning went unheeded. The Whitmore family tightened their security measures instead. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation. On the night of August 15th, 1840, during a violent thunderstorm with unusual atmospheric conditions, something occurred at the Whitmore estate that would never be fully explained. The following morning, the guards assigned to the carriage house were found unconscious. All 4 of them collapsed with identical expressions of terror frozen on their faces. When revived, none could remember what had happened, though one kept repeating, "They merged." They merged over and over. The carriage house stood open, both doors unlocked from the inside. The structure itself was empty, but the interior had been transformed in a way that no one could adequately explain. One half of the building was covered in a thick layer of frost, icicles hanging from the rafters despite the summer heat. The other half was scorched black, wood charred as though exposed to intense heat. Yet nothing had caught fire. Most disturbing was the center line where these two extremes met. Along this boundary, reality itself seemed uncertain, wavering between frozen and burned, as though existence couldn't decide which state to maintain. On the wall between the two halves was a mark that no one could adequately explain. It appeared to be simultaneously a scorch mark and a frost pattern shifting between the two depending on the angle from which it was viewed. Its shape suggested a human form, but one that contained 2 figures overlapping, merging into a single impossible shape. More disturbing still was what was found in each half of the carriage house. In Solomon's paler quarters, everything had darkened slightly. In Silas's darker quarters, everything had lightened slightly. It was as though each twin had left behind some essence of himself, or perhaps had taken some essence of his other half in preparation for a merging that had finally occurred. The Whitmore family immediately organized search parties, offering substantial rewards. But from that night forward, Solomon and Silas were never seen together again in any verifiable way. What did continue were sightings, reports that would persist for decades. Throughout the late 1840s and into the 1850s, people reported seeing strange figures at dawn and dusk, sometimes a pale man alone, sometimes a dark man alone, but most often both simultaneously in different locations miles apart. But there were other reports that spoke of something else entirely. Several witnesses claimed to have seen in particular, lighting conditions, a single figure that seemed to be both pale and dark simultaneously, a man whose appearance shifted depending on the angle of view. An account from 1845, recorded by a traveler named Marcus Bennett, described such an encounter. "I was riding along the Colster Road at dusk when I saw a man standing by the roadside. As I approached, I could not determine if he was of pale or dark complexion, for he seemed to be both. When I drew alongside him, he turned to face me, and I saw that he possessed 4 eyes, 2 pale and 2 dark, all looking at me with the same expression of profound sadness mixed with triumph. I heard a voice, or perhaps 2 voices speaking in perfect unison, say, "We are almost whole again. Soon we will be one." Then he or they simply stepped backward and vanished. The Whitmore family never recovered from the scandal. Robert Whitmore died in 1842 of what physicians termed a wasting disease, though those who attended him spoke of how he would call out in his delirium about the merging and 2 becoming one, and the impossibility of keeping divided what was meant to be whole. His wife retreated from society entirely. The estate stood empty for many years as no one wished to purchase a property with such a disturbing history. Interviews with descendants of enslaved people who had served in the Whitmore estate revealed that stories of the twins had been passed down through generations. One particularly detailed account came from the great-grandson of a stable hand. "My great-grandpa used to say that Mr. Solomon and Mr. Silas weren't really 2 people at all. He said they were one soul that had been split when they were born, and that they spent every moment trying to get back together. He said on the night the twins escaped, there was a sound like thunder, but not quite, and a flash of light that was both bright and dark at the same time. After that, nobody ever saw 2 separate men again. What they saw was one being that was both and neither, something that existed between pale and dark, between separate and joined, between human and something else entirely." Throughout the remainder of the 19th century and into the 20th, reports continued. A farmer in 1863 reported seeing a man who couldn't decide what color he was shifting between pale and dark as I watched. A railroad worker in 1887 described a figure that seemed to be 2 people overlapping, one light and one shadow, moving as one. During a solar eclipse in 1922, multiple witnesses reported seeing a man whose appearance seemed to shift and change, lightening and darkening in rhythm with the eclipse itself. Most tellingly, the phenomenon of the dual temperature continued to be reported, often preceding unusual events or appearing at sites where boundaries seemed thin: crossroads, riverbanks, thresholds, mirrors, dawn, and dusk hours. In 1927, an elderly woman named Rachel Washington was interviewed by a graduate student. She made a statement that has become widely quoted. "People always ask what happened to those twin boys, but they're asking the wrong questions. Those boys didn't go nowhere. They finally got back together. They became what they were always meant to be, one soul and one body. Or maybe one soul that don't need a body no more. The white folks tried to keep them split apart because they were scared. Well, they did come together. And what happened is they became something we don't have a word for." In 1965, when the former Whitmore estate was scheduled for development, workers discovered that the old carriage house, though structurally sound, had never lost its temperature anomaly. One half remained inexplicably cold, the other inexplicably hot, with a narrow zone between them where both temperatures existed simultaneously. The mark on the wall between the 2 halves remained visible, and workers reported that it seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Most significantly, when the structure was cleared, workers discovered something hidden beneath the floorboards: a small wooden box containing 2 objects. One was a lock of pale hair tied with a black ribbon. The other was a lock of dark hair tied with a white ribbon. The hair had been intertwined so completely that it was impossible to separate the strands. When the box was opened, the dual temperature phenomenon intensified so strongly that several workers had to leave. The hair locks were donated to the Georgia Historical Society. Attempts to analyze them using DNA technology yielded confusing results. The pale hair and dark hair showed genetic markers suggesting they came from a single individual, as though one person had produced 2 distinct types of hair. Scientists have been unable to explain this finding. Today, the story of Solomon and Silas exists in that uncertain space between history and legend. The few academic historians who have studied the case propose various theories: rare psychological conditions, exaggerated accounts, shared delusions, but these explanations fail to account for documented facts, multiple reliable witnesses, the physical evidence, the genetic anomaly, and continuing reports of encounters. Dr. Amin, Jennifer Hartwell, who wrote her dissertation on the case in 2008, stated in her conclusion, "After years of research, I have come to accept that some aspects of this case will never be adequately explained within our current frameworks of understanding. What occurred in Savannah between 1839 and 1840 involved phenomena that we do not yet have the language or concepts to fully comprehend. They began as two. They strove to become one, and if the continuing reports are to be believed, they succeeded in achieving a state that is neither two nor one, but something else entirely. To this day, people in Georgia claim to encounter what they call the Twilight Brother or the Twin Soul, a figure seen at dawn or dusk, at crossroads and thresholds, a being that seems to be both pale and dark, both one and two. These accounts are easily dismissed as folklore. But then there is the temperature phenomenon. Multiple people, many with no knowledge of the historical case, report encountering strange temperature fluctuations, areas of extreme cold adjacent to areas of extreme heat, zones where both temperatures exist simultaneously, and those who encounter this phenomenon sometimes report a feeling of presence, a sense of being observed by four eyes, too pale and too dark, of being seen from two perspectives simultaneously. Perhaps the final word belongs to an anonymous entry in the Georgia Historical Society's archive guest book written in 2018. I came here to research my family history and happened upon the Solomon and Silas files by accident. As the sun set, I swear I felt the temperature shift, both cold and hot at once. When I looked up, I saw reflected in the window glass a figure standing behind me. But when I turned, no one was there. Yet in the reflection, I could still see him or them, one form that seemed to contain two looking at me with eyes both pale and dark. I heard or perhaps felt words. We are still here, still together, still one and two and neither. We are what happens when the divided finally merges. Then the reflection faded, leaving only the dual temperature sensation. And so the story of the impossible secret of the enslaved twin brothers in Georgia history ends. Or perhaps doesn't end, but continues in a different form, transformed from documented history into persistent mystery. Something extraordinary occurred in Savannah in the 1840s, something that still echoes through the region in whispers and temperature shifts and strange sightings. On humid nights in Georgia, when the air is thick and the boundary between day and night seems uncertain, some people still report encountering that dual temperature phenomenon, simultaneously hot and cold. And those who know the story will whisper a prayer or blessing acknowledging the presence of something that was divided but refused to remain separate, something that fought its way back to wholeness, something that exists now in that liminal space between one and two, between present and absent, between the natural and the supernatural. They say if you listen carefully in those moments, you can hear breathing, two sets of lungs inhaling and exhaling in perfect synchronization, creating harmonics that resonate in the chest and bones, communicating directly to something deep within us about what it means to be split and to yearn for reunification, what it means to be divided and to fight to become whole again. And perhaps that is the true lesson of Solomon and Silas. They remind us that there are bonds strong enough to transcend any barrier, connections deep enough to survive any attempt at separation, and that sometimes, against all odds, unity will find a way to become complete again. The impossible secret of the enslaved twin brothers in Georgia history is not that they were unusual or that strange phenomena occurred in their presence. The secret is that they were never truly two separate beings at all, but rather one soul that had been torn in half, and that they spent their entire observable existence fighting to undo that division. And if the legends are true, they succeeded. They are whole now, existing in that space between visible only at certain times, when the light is neither full day nor full night, when the world itself seems balanced between different states of being. And in that space they are together finally and forever. One soul in one impossible form that is both pale and dark, both present and absent, both of this world and beyond it. That is the impossible secret that no one could ever explain. It speaks to something so profound and so fundamental to the human experience that we lack the language to express it fully. The knowledge that we are all in some sense divided from ourselves, separated from our wholeness, and that our deepest longing is to be reunited with whatever part of us we have lost, to become complete, to be finally, impossibly perfectly whole.